Welcome back to another episode of the Mainly Hoops podcast. We're back with another SEC team preview. We've got the Texas A&M Aggies under first-year head coach Bucky McMillan. Before we do dive in, if you have been enjoying our off-season content, please go ahead and like and subscribe. We do appreciate everyone's support. But looking here at the outlook of the new look, Aggies obviously saw Buzz Williams leave for Maryland in a bit of a surprising move as that transpired, but hired Bucky McMillan here. First year for him, offensive outlook. What strengths do you see here?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely a brand new roster. A lot of new faces here. I think there's 12, or actually no, the whole roster is pretty much new. But yeah, I mean you're going to see a different style, and you're going to see another extreme style of basketball under Bucky McMillan on both ends of the floor. But just talking about the offense first, I mean, you're going to see a super fast-paced rim and three based offense, either looking for a catch and shoot three or a shot at the rim. There's really no mid-range or intermediate game involved within this offense. We saw it at Samford for however long he was there, and they were in the 95th percentile in rim and three rate last season and 22nd nationally in pace. So I do think we see some similar things, and I think he has some pieces to execute this style with the shooting and scoring depth at his disposal. I think Pop Isaacs is probably the headliner of this group, but A&M can score it by committee, honestly, with this style. They don't really need a star. We have guys like Jakari Lane coming from North Alabama, who's going to be paired with Isaacs in the backcourt. Rylan Griffin as an off-ball shooter. Mackenzie Ibako in the same role. Maybe he plays a little bit more on ball than we saw at Indiana, and I think there's somewhat of a breakout in store for him. And then you have the kid from Spain, Ruben Dominguez, who can really shoot it. He's a super talented shooter. Not sure how much he plays early on, but he does seem like a really solid system fit for Bucky McMillan. And all these guys are going to be able to play off of one another, playing super fast pace, spacing the floor. I think it's going to make the transition for these guys a lot easier, even though they haven't played any true minutes together in a meaningful game. They also have some interior base guards off the bench that can provide somewhat of a change of pace, or guys that can create advantages for some of these off-ball shooters in a guy like Marcus Hill, who was at NC State last season, Josh Holloway, who was at Samford with Bucky McMillan a year ago, and Ali Deba, who, they're all solid creators who like to get into the paint. They like to score at the rim, but they all are capable passers and able to kick out to some of these shooters. So I do think they're going to be a really tough team to guard. And I also think, if they're not making shots at a high level, I think they have some ability to get on the offensive glass, with Federico and Rashawn Agee, who I think officially got cleared a couple days ago. They were still trying to figure that out. I don't really know how you're still dealing with eligibility stuff at this point. It has to be tough on these coaches, but you do have a couple guys here that are solid on the offensive glass, and you can play a little small ball with Rashawn Agee at the 5, and he can create that real 5-out spacing element. So yeah, in year one in the Bucky Ball era, they're going to be a really tough offense to guard.
Yeah, just a note about Agee. He was supposedly granted temporary eligibility. So I don't know exactly what that means. It's, I guess, something to monitor a little bit further. But when we did our transfer portal review, he was a player I was kind of high on for this team as a guy who can stretch the floor. Obviously, last year shot at 39% from behind the arc. He has versatility. He gets on the offensive glass. Like you said, he can play a little bit of 5 at 6'8". So I think he's a really key piece to this offense to go along with, the guards they brought in to kind of fit this, as you said, the Bucky Ball offense. For me, there are a couple weaknesses I thought worthy of mentioning. One of them, and this is kind of just a Bucky Ball weakness in general, and it's taking care of the basketball because they play such a fast pace, right? It's very conducive to turnovers, right? And you're looking at a guy like Pop Isaacs who's going to have the ball a bunch. He's a career 18% turnover rate guy. 19% last year and in only 8 games at Creighton. But, he hasn't taken care of the ball at a fantastic level. Jakari Lane's been fine, but, coming from the ASUN, in my eyes, one of the weaker conferences in the country now, coming to the SEC, a bit of a jump. And then you have guys like Mbako and Rylan Griffin, who are more off-ball guys and are now going to be playing a more sped-up style. So I have concerns with them taking care of the basketball, like most Bucky McMillan teams do. Like last year at Samford, he was 283rd in turnover rate. He's never finished better than 156th. Back in 2023, he's typically, every other year it's been between 232 and 293. So I think that's definitely an area of concern. Just with a faster pace, it's just going to happen. And with what they have, I think it's more likely to happen. And then, another thing would be just like the front court scoring. I think like AG can provide that for them, but like Federico is, an offensive rebound, dunk it back in, or like a lob threat guy. You're never going to play through him in the post. Another guy like that has hardly ever played, and I don't really know if he's going to have a role, is Zach Clemens coming over from Kansas. So I just think like the front court scoring is a big question mark. Like there are guards and there are talent, like you said. There are guys that can shoot it from the perimeter. There are guys that can get to the rim to kind of complement the Bucky style well. But I think the overall like front court scoring is certainly lacking unless you're throwing a lob up to Federico. So like AG, like I said, I think he can be a key piece for this team in terms of interior scoring. But other than him, there's just not a ton to rely on in the front court on offense.
Yeah, I would agree. And one thing, I just feel like I know Zach Clements a little bit too well for never really playing a role in college basketball. He's a grad student now. I feel like he's been in college basketball for 10 years and he really hasn't played much of a role. But he might play a role in the defensive end this season. But yeah, I would agree with the turnover issues, mostly just style driven. I do think they have more handling depth to kind of offset it. So I don't see them as being like a horrendous group, but I do think the style is just going to lead to them forcing more turnovers, relentlessly attacking to the rim when there isn't really a driving lane there is going to lead to some stuff like that. But, yeah, you said you had concerns with the interior presence. I'm kind of just worried about the rim scoring ability across the board. I think the spacing may help, it could create more driving lanes, but I do think there's just a lack of interior scoring talent at the top of this roster. Pop Isaacs is just not a good interior scorer at all. He's super erratic around the rim. It's really not pretty with him. He was an 18th percentile rim scorer at Texas Tech. I didn't use the Creighton sample size because the Creighton sample size wasn't great either. So I'm not really cherry picking this. But there's no real lift. There's no real creativity around the rim with him. Jakari Lane's probably too small to score at the rim and, doesn't have a ton of creativity. He's a guy that likes to, get downhill. There's just no true creativity around the rim with him. And he's listed at 6 foot. I would be shocked. I would be surprised if he was actually 6 feet tall. You have Mbako, who's a 65th percentile rim scorer, but he really struggles to get to the rim. There's really no burst or creative handle with him. It was a 12th percentile field goal attempt percentage frequency. And then like Rylan Griffin, Ruben Dominguez, strictly off-ball shooters. They're not really creating anything at the cup. And then you mentioned Federico, who is a low usage play finisher. AG can do a little bit, attacking closeouts in like a pick and pop scenario. But besides that, I just think as much spacing as there's going to be with this roster, I do think they're going to struggle to capitalize on it to score at the rim consistently.
Yeah, no, I agree. I had jotted down a note about Pop Isaacs. Like in that small sample size last year, he was like 45% at the rim. Obviously a small sample size, but it's been an issue for him for his whole career. Now shifting to the defensive side of the ball now, I know, off camera you've shared, that you have some concerns with this side, but strengths first. What strengths do you see on this end?
Yeah, I do have some strengths, despite me not really loving this defense. And a lot of it is style driven. You're going to see a lot of full court pressing. You're just going to see a lot of active hands with this defense, and I think it's going to lead to them forcing turnovers. Um, top 20 nationally at Sanford with this Bucky scheme each of the last 2 seasons. I'm not sure we see that number inside the top 20, but I do think it's going to be a plus quality in this league. Sanford pressed on 41.9% of defensive possessions last season, which was, among the leaders in the nation. It was a 99th percentile frequency. I'm not sure they can stay at that rate against like power conference competition, and you're playing against some of the best guards in the country here in this league, so it's going to be tough to press at that rate. But it's a quality of a Bucky McMillan defense, so we're definitely going to see it. And they do have some guys that can fit like a heavy pressing scheme, like Jakari Lane, and then Marcus Hill and Josh Holloway off the bench. They fit the mold as like quick twitch and like energetic, fiery guards who are just going to love to pressure the ball in general. And then Ali Deba as well. He's going to be another guy that fits here well. So I do think they're going to be able to force some turnovers at a high level. Like Josh Holloway was in this system last year at Sanford. He had a 3.2% steal rate. And, the rest of these guys don't possess like necessarily high steal rates, but I think their system fits. And, the more pressure you play with, like, I think there's a little bit more in the tank. Lane 2.2%, Marcus Hill 1.6, but I do think I wouldn't be shocked if we saw a 3% plus steal rate number from them this year.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's just the theme with Bucky McMillan defenses. They're going to force turnovers just by style, and I think, like you said, there's some talent here on this end to be able to do that. It will be tougher, I think, just because it is the SEC. And what they have, to be in that top 20, just to like maintain that. You're playing, some of the best teams in the country every night. So I think it'll be a little bit more challenging, but still should be a solid point on their defense. For me, on the defensive end, there are a few weaknesses I took note of. One, just like the front court depth in general, like we talked about on the offensive end. Federico, who's really never played more than half a game. Zach Clements, who's played no more than like 7% of minutes in his career. They're kind of the two guys in the front court. Like Federico isn't a great defensive rebounder. Zach Clements, just has never really played, and I think he's still not going to have a huge role. I think we might see more Rashawn Agee at the 5. So Clements isn't playing as high of minutes, but I think, defensive rebounding is going to be an issue for this team, as it typically is with Bucky McMillan teams, right? You look at last year, 327th in defensive rebounding rate, year before 311th. I think this roster is really no different. Federico's at like 13% defensive rebound rate. He's not a fantastic rim protector. He showed more rim protection at Pitt in the ACC, but has moved to the Big 12, 4.4% block rate last year. Now going to the SEC, I have some concerns just with the overall rim protection depth, because that's not Zach Clements' 2.6% block rate last year. He was solid the 2 years prior, in a little bit bigger of a role at Kansas, but I just don't think his role is going to be big enough to really make an impact in that area. Rashawn Agee, 4.3% block rate, but he's an undersized guy. If he's playing the 5, I don't really love that as your rim protection. And then another weakness to throw out there, is the backcourt group. In like Pop Isaacs in particular, who, isn't a good defender. Really, I mean, like he's a 1.9% career steal rate guy. He's undersized in my opinion. He just doesn't really provide much value on the defensive end. You mentioned Jakari Lane, 6 feet. I just think there's some issues with like the positional size of the backcourt in terms of their overall switchability. Like they're going to be able to pressure. they're smaller guards that can maybe force some turnovers. But there are issues with that group. Then a guy like Rylan Griffin, not a great defender. So I just think like the overall like on ball talent is a little bit lacking on this Texas A&M team.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at, Bucky's defenses at Sanford, he has a 5-year sample size. He's been pretty turnover reliant through that entire stretch, and really every other category has been lacking. Like you look at effective field goal percentage has been really bad. Defensive rebounding has been really bad. They foul a ton. Just the rim protection in the 2-point defense has been pretty poor. You can't be a turnover forcing reliant defense in the best conference in America. Like these teams do too many things well. Like if you run into a team that takes care of the ball at a high level, where are you going to go? And it just doesn't seem like they can really go anywhere. And that's my main concern is like, does this scheme actually have any success in a power conference league? And he's never had a defense inside of the top 130. And besides that defense that finished 132nd, his defenses were outside the top 200. So it just doesn't really seem to, the scheme it's too extreme for me. And I think this chaotic style of play works better on the offensive end than it does on the defensive end. I think that's pretty well proven with, just the efficiency rates throughout his entire coaching career, just for those effective field goal percent. They were 297th in effective field goal percentage last season, 327th in defensive rebound rate, and 349th in free throw rate allowed at Sanford. Like, it just goes to prove that this is a turnover forcing reliant team. And I just don't, like you mentioned, like, I don't really like the roster either. I just don't really think they have solid defenders throughout this roster, like Lane, Isaacs, Griffin, and Baco. That's probably the starting group besides the center position. Federico probably starts at the 5. Like, I don't really like any of those 4 defenders there. And I just don't really think their lateral movement is completely there. And, I think this is more of like for Bucky, it's more of he's just going to try to figure out how he wants to defend in the SEC. Like, I just don't think we're going to see this extreme chaotic style after this season. I think he's going to have to tone it back. And we've seen a lot of coaches that, are coming from the mid-major ranks with unique schemes that have had to almost completely overhaul what they've done from a defensive standpoint. The one that really stands out to me is like Brad Underwood at Illinois. He was at Stephen F. Austin. They played an extremely like turnover forcing heavy style. And now it's just the complete opposite. They play deep drop coverage. They value giving up shots in the mid range and yeah, it's just a completely different brand of basketball. And I think this is kind of what that looks like. It's more of just like Bucky's going to figure out that this isn't going to work at a high level. And we may see some different attempts at schemes or him just toning it back from the pressure based style in general.
Yeah. It'll be something to monitor, I think, just based on how this season goes. Looking at MVP and X Factor for Texas A&M, who'd you go with?
I went with Pop Isaacs as my MVP. I just think he's gonna be the leader of this backcourt. I think he's gonna be the guy who's creating shots for others as well. I think he's a pretty underrated passer, and he's just the guy that translates up the best. We're seeing a lot of mid-major guards come up that have their deficiencies, and I think Pop Isaacs is probably the most certain guy in this backcourt. And this offense and this fast-paced offense, rim and 3 based, is going to put a lot of pressure on these guards to create, and I think Isaacs is going to do it the best. And for my X factor, I went with Mackenzie and Baco. I just think there's just more offense in the tank than he showed at Indiana. He was just kind of running off screens in that scheme, and a heavy diet of shots in the mid range. And we're not really going to see that here. I think Mbako is going to be used a little bit wiser than he was at his days at Indiana. And yeah, I just think there's more shooting in the tank with him as well. And there's not a ton of like true 4s on this roster. And I think he's going to have to be the guy that connects everything on the offensive end at the very least.
Yeah, I went with Pop Isaacs as my MVP as well, for a lot of the same reasons. I think there's going to be, a lot on his plate on the offensive end. I think, like we said, he has his issues at the rim, but I think he's just going to have the greatest impact here. He's going to have the ball in his hands the most. You know, he needs to take care of the basketball, but he's going to be generating shots for everyone on this roster. I think, you know, last year, I think his number was like a 24% assist rate. So, you know, he needs to be that guy, and I think he will be. For me, X Factor, I went with Reshaping Aggies. Obviously just got cleared. But I think his versatility in like that 4-5 spot, with the question marks around like the backup 5 position with Federico never really having played more than half a game. I think AG can be a really nice swing piece for this team, on both ends of the floor, but primarily like on the offensive end with his ability to stretch the floor as that like 4-5 man, should be really key for this offense.
Yeah, I considered him. I just like didn't know for sure if he was going to be ready for the season, but yeah, that's a fair point. I think there's going to be a lot of small ball displayed, and you know he's going to be a really important aspect of that, really on both ends of the floor. I think he plays much bigger than his 6'8" listed height, so I do think. I mean, that looks like more of a 50-50 split between Federico and AG, and you know I think AG is going to provide a lot of nice things on both ends.
Yeah. Now for ceiling and floor and bold prediction, I'll start here. I had them at their ceiling at 7th in the SEC. I think there are issues on the defensive end, like we've talked about, style issues that could pose a problem, you know, coming to the SEC. But I think, you know, there's enough talent, at least on the offensive end, that they could finish at this point. You know, but at their floor, I think like 13th in the SEC is within the realm, just because the defense could lack a little bit. I'll get to that in my bold prediction. But you know, I think that there are a lot of avenues here for them. If they don't take care of the basketball as well, they could end up in this range in the SEC. You know, it's going to be interesting to see how the style develops. But for my bold prediction, you know, Texas A&M preseason adjusted defensive efficiency, 44th per Torvik. I have them projected to finish outside the top 75. You know, just there are a lot of issues here. I actually wouldn't be surprised if it was even further than that. Just like you said, you know, they force turnovers typically on Bucky McMillan teams, but every other number is a big problem. So I think it's pretty reasonable to think that could happen.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat there. For my ceiling floor, I mean, I had it a little bit lower. I think they can finish 9th in the league. I just have too many defensive concerns for them to really rise up the ranks of this league. I think the offense is like borderline a top 5 unit in this league. So I could still, like, you know, if you're 9th in the SEC, I still think you can get yourself into like that 8-9 seed range in the NCAA tournament. For my floor, I had them at 15th. I have too many concerns on the defensive side for, you know, I could just see the floor. I could just see it kind of bottoming out with this group, especially like I have some concerns with the rim offense as well. So I don't think the offense is like guaranteed to be awesome. I do think it's going to be pretty good, but that kind of leads me to my bold prediction is like I was defensive themed here. You had them, what'd you say, outside the top 75?
Yeah.
I put them as the worst defense in the SEC, you know, and there's what I think South Carolina was listed at what, like 105th defensively or something like that. And I think there's a path for A&M to be even worse than that. I just see too many issues on this end that, you know, I've already dove into. I could see them being in like that 125 range. I could see them being very, very lopsided. Like they could be a top 25 offense in the country, but if you're going to be in that outside of the top 100, it's going to be really tough for them to gain any traction in this league.
Yeah, no doubt. So we'll see what happens here in the first year of Bucky Ball, but that wraps things up with Texas A&M, and we'll see you next time on the Mainly Hoops podcast.